I'm the director of All Our Children, and welcome to this month's panel presentation. All Our Children's mission is to build the movement for education justice by supporting congregations and their leaders and members who are exploring, forming, and leading community partnerships with public schools. And we do this because too many children, most of them living in poverty and many of them children of color, receive a substandard education. And we believe that this is not God's dream. We believe that Jesus calls the church to engage our communities, to serve children, and to challenge injustice. To learn more about us and our work and our library of resources, to sign up for our newsletter, the best way to do that is to visit our website, allourchildren.org. Today's conversation is going to be about respecting public space between churches and schools. Congregational leaders, oftentimes, who may be eager to partner with a local school, sometimes encounter some skepticism or even some firm, direct opposition from school leaders or from members of their congregation. And they will often give the reason as the separation of church and state. So, and school leaders are, of course, responsible for protecting the safety and the well-being of the children and the teachers in their building. So we respect and appreciate that important difference. And perhaps in the past, they've had the experience of religiously affiliated groups crossing that boundary. And so school leaders are right, and we understand their reasons for being wary. Nevertheless, there is lots of space within the law for faith-motivated education advocates to take meaningful and effective action. Today's panel will explore how churches can serve children and school in public spaces while respecting both the letter and the spirit of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. So our goals today are to equip you, our participants, to speak accurately and invitingly about the value of the separation of church and state, to address the concerns of parents and teachers and school leaders and perhaps members of your own congregation, while also building trust that is so essential to powerful partnerships and relationships with the teachers, the staff, and the parents, so that you can establish a genuine partnership. This session is being recorded and broadcast live on Facebook Live, and will be available to view and to share immediately through Facebook immediately after this session. And a direct link to this recording will be sent to everybody who's on the call today, everybody who registered for the call. Will be sent to you within about a week. Mary Liz Murray, All Our Children's Director of Programming and Communications, will be monitoring our chat board. Mary Liz, will you describe a little bit more, say a little bit more about how that works?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. If you're not familiar with Zoom and you don't see a chat box on the right side of your screen, if you hover over your video, you'll get a menu at the bottom with white icons, and there should be one with 3 dots that says chat. And if you click that, the chat box should appear. If you have questions, if you want to share some resources you know of in the chat with everyone, we welcome all of your participation. I'll be active in the chat. Make sure when you chat with us that you choose the all panelists and attendees function from the drop-down box once you've opened up the chat, so that everyone can see your question. Lots of people want to have a conversation. If you're having any technical difficulty, you can feel free to chat me directly or use the raise your hand function, and I will be able to talk with you more directly.
Great, thanks, Mary Liz. Our panelists today are Marilyn Rhames of Teachers Who Pray. Wave at the group, Marilyn. Ruth Wong of the Boston Education Collaborative at the Emmanuel Gospel Center. And Eric Buehrer, president of Gateways to Better Education. And we made a mistake in some of our earlier materials and advertised Eric as an attorney. He is not an attorney, he's a former history teacher, so we will not be asking him or anyone else for any legal advice in the course of this call. So I'd like to ask each of you, Marilyn, starting with you, please, to do a little bit of an introduction. Tell us your name, your organization, your title, where you're located.
I'm Marilyn Rhames, and I am the founder and CEO of Teachers Who Pray, which is a national nonprofit organization, but it's based in Chicago.
Thank you. Ruth?
My name is Ruth Wong. I'm a program director at Emmanuel Gospel Center. The program is called Boston Education Collaborative. I'm a former teacher, and we're located in Boston.
Great. And Eric?
Eric Buehrer, founder and president of Gateways to Better Education, and we're located in Southern California.
Great. And Eric, sticking with you, I want to ask each of you to give us the really, really short version of your answer when people say to you, how can churches partner with public schools given the separation of church and state? Eric, what's your answer to that question?
I always advise that you ask what they mean by that, because I think it's such a broadly understood term, and sometimes it's misunderstood. And so the best thing to do, and what I do, is say, well, what do you mean by separation of church and state? And that starts a dialogue as to where they're concerned, what their concerns are. And I help them think that through a little bit more. Does that mean that churches and synagogues and mosques have to have their own fire departments and police departments because the state can't help them? And, often no, I don't mean that. Oh, okay. So let's start thinking about the parameters of what that really means. And that way it doesn't just use that, because a lot of times people use the separation of church and state as that's the conversation ender. As soon as I say that, everything has to stop. And so you continue the dialogue and ask them what they mean by it.
Great, thank you. Ruth, what's your short answer? What do you say?
Well, I usually say that churches are supposed to respect the laws considering separation of church and state. However, from the federal government down to the local governments, there's actually encouragement for faith communities to partner with state agencies because, for example, all the main departments in the U.S. Government, including the Department of Education, they all have an office called Office of Neighborhood and Neighborhood and Faith-Based Partnerships, kind of a long name. So to me, it says that, from the government side, they actually see the value of faith-based partners to come alongside state agencies and schools and have established offices to support that. But as faith communities, we do want to know how best to partner in a way that respects the separation of church and state.
Thank you. Marilyn, what's your short answer to that question?
My short answer is, would you turn away a body of people who love children, want to help the school, and want to serve your purposes at your school? And to me, that is ultimately the offering that the churches can give to a school is service. And part of that service is defined by the school itself. So, most people will think about that and say, I could use help copying or stapling papers or whatever. There's no faith involved in that at all. So what you're doing is you're cutting off opportunity based on your preconceived notions about what the people are actually in the school to do. So generally there's that misunderstanding happening. Many people automatically assume proselytizing when they hear church partnerships. So we're trying to get that cleared up front.
Great. Well, thanks all three of you. We're going to look now at the actual language of the First Amendment. And Mary Liz has that on a slide for us to share with everybody. And Eric, you're the former history teacher among us. And once Mary Liz gets this up for us all to look at, I wonder if you can say a little bit about your understanding of the original purpose of this amendment when it was first adopted back in 1791.
Well, of course, there was the issue of coming from England and Europe and the whole European background of the issue of the government and the church really being hand in hand. And so our founders saw the importance of religion, of course. It's throughout our various founding documents. But they wanted to make sure that the government didn't have any legislative authority, or I should say ecclesiastical authority, over churches. And they also wanted to make sure that the churches, the clergy, didn't have any legislative authority over the government. And so there was to be a separation. And yet it's interesting that when the Constitution was drafted and the amendments were put in, even at that time, there were state churches. Various states did have their own state churches, but they weren't federal. And so there was a transition period, but the idea that somehow there's this impenetrable wall where they have to be hermetically sealed off from one another was never the intent of the founders when they talked about the idea of respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Thank you so much. So folks who are watching the call, this one sentence in the orange on your slide, that is the entirety of the First Amendment. And there is as Eric was just saying, there are two clauses regarding religion in this. One is the establishment of religion, Congress, which shall make no law establishing religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And you'll see in the white box on the right on your screen that the 14th Amendment, which was passed not quite 100 years after the First Amendment was passed, I don't have that date right in front of me, meant that the state, that no individual state could make a law that limited any federal rights. So that's what applies this law at the state level as well, at least in my non-technical understanding. All right, thank you so much. So Marilyn, let me ask you this question: What does this non-establishment what does this mean in terms of what we can or cannot say or do in a school regarding our faith?
Well, when you look at the No Child Left Behind law, and now it's the ESSA law, but going back to No Child Left Behind, there were very specific explanations to what teachers can and cannot do in the classroom pertaining to religion. And the explanation, I think it was section 9524, specifically said that teachers cannot prohibit or encourage or discourage any belief, religious belief or activity with students in the classroom. So that means that teachers cannot promote a certain religion, nor can we discourage a religion. And oftentimes people focus on promoting the faith, promoting religion in class, but you can't discourage it either. And so a lot of times it's one-sided when we talk about the establishment of religion. So students have free range to express their religious beliefs amongst themselves in the classroom. They can read their Bible, they can pray with other students, as long as it's not disruptive to the classroom. And then also the explanation through teachers who, through No Child Left Behind, explain that teachers can also express their faith amongst themselves before or after school as free speech, which is what has motivated me to have Teachers Who Pray, because teachers praying before or after school on their duty-free lunch break to express their religious beliefs and encourage each other in the faith within the school building. But the reason why I go back to No Child Left Behind is because under the current ESSA law, there are no very specific explanations of religious expression. It simply tells you to go back to the First Amendment, go back to the Constitution, which leaves a lot of people unclear about what that means. So the best that we have right now in understanding the Establishment Clause, just from purely looking at education, federal education law, is the explanation that was provided through No Child Left Behind.
Thank you for that. Ruth, I wonder if you've had direct experience that you could share with us. I wonder what kind of resistance Have you met, maybe you've not met any, but I'm guessing that you have you met from leaders or staff at a public school? Do you have a personal story that you could share about what you encountered and how you addressed it?
So, interestingly enough, I personally have not actually had school leaders push back on this. Only one school did say to me it was more that they felt they were good, they didn't need any help, but other than that. But I have one story I could share, so it's not my personal experience, but one of our churches, when they first built a relationship with a school, the church leaders were invited to attend teacher-staff meeting by the principal. And at the meeting, one of the teachers raised her hand and said, "What if I don't believe in your Jesus?" And one of the pastors responded and just said, "You don't have to believe in our Jesus. We're here because we are motivated by our faith. We're motivated by our love for this, for the students and this community. But we're just here to serve. We're just here to help and come alongside you all." And that was his sort of short response. But over the next year or so, as the church showed up and cleaned the school or attended meetings or showed teacher appreciation through different forms, as they continue to show up and get to know the school. And one day there was an event at the school, and that same teacher came up to the pastor who had responded to her, and she basically expressed her appreciation and thanks, that she's like, I'm glad you guys are here. And so I think for me, for him and for us, that story really just showed that we made it clear our motivation is not here to proselytize. It's our faith that's motivating us. But then because they faithfully showed up and gave of themselves to that community, their actions really spoke loudly to this particular teacher, and she, kind of responded in a very surprising way.
That's wonderful. That's great. Eric, do you have a story that you can share?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I had an incident not related to a church specifically, but a group of homeschoolers who were from churches that were working with a local school district to use its facilities. That's one of the things that we have here in Southern California. There can be a relationship between a school district and homeschoolers for facilities use. And so it was coming up on Easter, and the homeschoolers wanted to do an Easter production, a play about the death and resurrection of Christ at the school, not for the public school students, but just to use their facility. And the principal had a real problem with that. That's very religious. And so I was invited to come and sit down with him, and we always advise taking a help me understand strategy. Help me understand what your concern is, and you're really hearing what the person's issues are. And then I was able to transition and show him that in California, it's perfectly acceptable for students to recognize things like holidays, the religious nature of holidays. And as long as it's an educational experience, not a devotional experience. And so even though these are homeschoolers, they can do this within a public school environment because it's going to be an educational, dramatic experience and so forth. Well, at the end of that conversation, to my surprise, he said, okay, so they can do the production as long as at the end of it, they also explain its meaning. Then it has academic purpose. Well, okay, I'll do that too. So what I find is we have to, as Ruth had said, we have to think in terms of what is the educator looking for? What is the school looking for? And how can we help them meet their needs? And in this situation, it was just the man needed to have the language by which he could defend this and say, look, this is done for educational purposes. It's not devotional purposes, and it's perfectly fine. And so I think, again, if we as Christians focus more on how are we meeting the needs of the school, and how are we helping administrators who have a problem with maybe some of the language we use, if we can help them see it's more of an academic or it's a service sort of thing, where mentoring or tutoring or serving, and it's meeting, they can check boxes of here are issues that I have, and here's how this group is helping me meet those issues. I think you're going to be in much better standing. I discourage people who want to go into the schools with a reach my kids for Christ mentality, because while obviously as Christians we want to tell people about the Lord, there are times and places to do that. And when you're asked and entrusted by the school to come in and do a particular task, you need to honor that. And so it's important that we also think in terms of our own motivations and what are we really trying to do, and honor the understanding that the school has when we're involved with them.
I wanted to stick with you for a minute, Eric, because you said something there that I want to lift up for people, and that is that as you were listening to this principal who was concerned about the use of the space at the school, you heard you heard his concern, right? So I'm wondering how do we know when a school leader actually is interested in learning more? I'm not talking about in a proselytizing mode, but in terms of a don't establish, don't discriminate kind of way. How do we what can we be listening for in these conversations that might suggest to us that this school leader wants some help in understanding how to make this possible?
Well, I think if you can start out with what are his or her needs, what are the sorts of things you're looking for, and how can we help with that? Instead of us coming in and saying, we want you to accept us, instead we should come in with a, how can I be of help? What are the things that you're trying to, and they're looking at academic issues, they're looking at behavioral issues that might be, tutoring, mentoring, they're looking at just facilities issues that need cleaning or whatever it might be. And if you start there, it's going to be much better. And if the issue of religion comes up, and I frankly have not encountered that, where it's just oh, no, we can't. It's more of a sense of how do we make this work? How can we do this in a way that is good for everyone? Yeah. And so I think if you were to encounter the resistance, it would be a short conversation. They would probably just be pleasant, but try to cut you off. Mm-hmm. And again, if at that level, you just kind of have to keep asking. So what is it that you're hesitant about? What are the concerns that you might have? And then if need be, you could go to an administrator above them, the superintendent, board members, but again, not in a board meeting, not in an official, we demand this or that, but more of a just, hey, we want to help. And there might be some misunderstanding in some of our schools as to what can be done and how we can work with you. And would you help us clear that up? Because we want to really bless the school, bless the kids, bless the staff. Mm-hmm. And I think if you just take it from that approach, you're going to find much more open doors. Because I think the administrators that I talk to recognize that they have so much on their plate, they can't handle all the issues that their students have. And they're looking for that kind of outside help. They just want to know that they're not going to be cut off at the knees because you did something in the school that they didn't anticipate you were going to do.
Right. Marilyn, I wonder, do you have a story of an encounter with a school leader? Because I have, if not, I've got another question that I can ask of you.
Well, I would like to just address one thing to that point. It's not necessarily a story, but being an educator for 14 years, I know that there is no training for faith, like religious expression in schools. At least I've never encountered a professional development, a class in graduate school, any kind of formal training offered to explain what is allowed and what's not allowed regarding faith in public schools. So this is an area of like neglect and dirt in the public education sector. As a matter of fact, I was in DC I had lunch with a prominent education lawyer in Washington, D.C. All things education, she explains it. She has her own firm, very knowledgeable. When I asked her to help me with an issue about faith and education law, she said, well, that's the one area that I really don't feel comfortable talking about, because that's actually a constitutional lawyer who needs to address that issue. And because that deals squarely with the First Amendment. And so if she doesn't understand the law regarding faith and education and can't speak to it, it's no wonder why there's misconceptions happening all over all the time. So it just behooves all of us in this space to grasp this understanding as much as we can. Not that we'll ever be attorneys, that's not the goal, but to be able to articulate in a very coherent way what is acceptable and what's not, and explain that to other educators, because a lot of times if there is resistance, it's just for the lack of knowledge. They don't know, they're confused, they're worried about getting in trouble. So
Sure.
yeah, just to break that down for them.
So I want to stay with you, Marilyn. So how have you been able to describe your faith motivation, which is the basis, I know, of the work that you do? How do you describe your own personal faith motivation to people in the school setting in a way that is reassuring to them? What language do you use to describe why you do what you do?
Well, I put on my education hat, and from the standpoint of Teachers Who Pray, I recently did a TED Talk called Why Faith Will Fix Education. And in that talk, I say that there's so many things I can say, but generally, the act of teaching requires a lot of divine qualities: patience, kindness, gentleness, meekness, all the fruits of the Spirit. But teachers in themselves are human. And we deal with human life issues like everybody else. So for me personally, my faith motivation is to bridge the gap between my humanity, which is frustrated, wants to quit, is outraged all the time by the injustices that I see in the world, with the humanity, the divinity of the act that I'm trying to produce. And prayer is one way, and faith is one way for me to regularly, consistently deliver quality education. And so prayer is the gap between the divinity of teaching and the humanity of being a teacher. And so that's how I approach it. That's how I explain it from a personal standpoint.
Ruth, how about you? How do you answer that same question? How do you describe the faith basis of the work that you do to secular people or school-based people?
I guess for me, it's been sort of a combination, very much like Marilyn. Having been a teacher, I know for my former students, it always took the village to come alongside this child, and I had benefited from having teams of people come alongside young people. And so I think the motivation part I shared earlier about, the service, the love, that we're commissioned as Christians to love our neighbors, and we want to be good neighbors, and we want to know how to come alongside a school and are motivated by that. But I also talk about the fact that within the churches, there are individuals who have resources and connections and skills, talents, gifts that just are under leveraged, and schools, if they seek that village, from the community, churches are a source for those people, and we want to, where we're not great at knowing how to engage in schools, but if schools are open, I often talk about that there are people who want to live out their faith by being, one of those supporters. So yeah.
Eric, do you have volunteers in your program? The question that I'm interested in is how do we train and equip and support our volunteers to make sure that they stay on the right side around these issues? And I wonder if you have any experience with that.
Well, we work mainly with educators when it comes to how to teach about Christianity and the Bible in a public school classroom setting. In fact, thinking about what Marilyn was talking about, there's kind of two issues here. One is, what can a teacher do in the classroom? And then the other is what we're talking about today is, how does a church interact with a school? And of course, when it comes to the teacher, it's about teaching academically. And you can teach all about Christianity and the Bible as long as there's an academic motivation for it, not an evangelistic motivation for it. In fact, state academic standards expect students, Massachusetts, for instance, in 7th grade, expects every student to understand the message of Jesus Christ. And it even says, quote unquote, the concept of salvation. Not from they have no altar calls to the chalkboard, but they want students to understand Christianity. And it's right there in the 2003 academic standard. So it's not, from 1950 or something. But then on the other hand, you also have, how does a community of believers interact with the school? And I think there is a thread that combines both of those, and that is helping students see Christianity as a force for good in the world. As I often say so many times, the only thing students learn about Christianity when it comes to Christian history is by studying the Crusades, the Inquisitions, and the Salem witch trials. And there's so much more that they should understand about Christianity than just the bad things in our history. And also then, when you have community members who are giving of themselves to help a school in some way, they are demonstrating Christianity as a force for good in the world. And so I think that's kind of the common thread between the two. And I think that's where the faith community can have a tremendous impact, whether it's in the content of what students learn or just in the demonstration of believers loving their neighbors. They're showing and demonstrating Christianity as a force for good in the world.
Mm-hmm. Ruth, I know that some of the congregations that you work with in the Boston Education Collaborative have volunteers that are engaged in direct service to kids and teachers in schools. What do you recommend, and what would you celebrate and lift up about the way that they train their volunteers and equip them to address these issues?
Yeah, I would say that some of the different ways have been mainly around tutoring and mentoring, at least within the school context. And so for tutoring, for example, our churches are given a role and a task to do with the young person, whether to read with them or help them with their math or science. And so the volunteers know that that is their main responsibility, and they get trained to do that and to respect that during the time that they have with the students, that's their work. I think that one of the things our mentors and tutors also understand is, as you are spending time with students and teachers and even parents, there's a relationship that's developing. And so, there are concerns sometimes from church leaders and volunteers about, can they be themselves in that context? And so what we've seen is that, as relationships are built, people, just as you share about life with each other, teachers, parents, they know your affiliation. You're part of a church. That's why you're here. And kind of like what we said earlier, if they're asking you questions about who you are, and the parents know these tutors and mentors, there is, and if they start to ask, there is this ability and freedom to kind of share just about our lives with each other. And it goes both ways. It's not just one way. But really understanding the roles and responsibilities that we have, even as a mentor, you are spending time with a young person, doing something fun, but you might be asking them questions about what are their goals, and, asking them school-related kind of questions or goal-setting kind of questions. And so that's really our main role, and respecting that that's what you should prioritize.
Yeah, as I like to say, when a student asks you a question, be honest, but be brief. Don't say, now that you've asked, let me share how you too can have a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's going too far. But if the student asks you something about your faith or what you do on Sunday or whatever it is, you can be honest, just be brief.
Yeah.
So that's a nice segue. I want to ask Marilyn, because how local faith communities, local faith partnerships, which I know is different from the organization that you run, Teachers Who Pray, but how can a local faith congregation support the teachers or school staff who come to them looking for Christian community?
Wow, good question.
I know. I was thinking about you as we were thinking about that question. I said, that's one for Marilyn.
For sure. So even though Teachers Who Pray, we have our limits of what we do, I connect with so many different wonderful organizations like yours and Eric's and hopefully Ruth's at some point. So I think that the best thing, okay, so I'll give you an example. There's a school here in Chicago that I talked about, Harper High School. In 2012, they had 10% of their student body. It was only like maybe 300 students there, in high school. 10% of their student body had gotten shot. That's 30 kids.
Ooh.
12 of them passed away in one school year. It made NPR, This American Life. And you can look it up about Harper High School and you can hear the story over, I think, 2 or 3 episodes. Well, the principal at that high school reached out to some churches. And one church answered the call and began to come to the school every week with volunteers. They had morning prayer with the principal once a week, which is allowed, like I said, before or after school. And some of the students there decided to have a Christian club, which is allowed because it's student generated and student led. And just like any other club, they could form their Christian club. And through the Christian club and through the morning prayers with the principal, and then just more community involvement in general between the congregation of this church and the school, they drastically dropped the suspensions, the arrests, which was also a big problem at the school, expulsions. And this was public knowledge. The head of the Office of Safety and Security of the district, Chicago Public Schools, has publicly said in meetings that the community involvement at this school helped turn around this dangerous climate. Mm. Now, the school is not out of the woods. As a matter of fact, it's going to close in about 3 years, and they're going to open up a brand new school and merge a bunch of schools together. But the immediate impact that this had on the school was tremendous. A lot of times we have schools that are suffering from discipline problems and low academic standards. The principals would open their doors happily to get community support because the school in a lot of ways is like a microcosm of the community itself. And so the help is very much needed. And so I would go in, as I think all of us said before, with the mindset of helping. How can we help? What can we do for you? And you would be surprised at the reception that you would get, especially in the neediest schools. A lot of the schools, I imagine, that would close the door on these opportunities are the ones that are maybe affluent, or they think that they're fine. They don't need volunteers. I don't know many schools like that where I'm from, but I'm sure they exist. But turning away people who generally come with an offering of help and with the right motivation and the trust that needs to be built. I think that the possibilities are really spectacular. Yeah.
Ruth, do you have any examples or any stories around that same question about how local faith partners can support the teachers and school staff who come to them looking for Christian community or Christian support?
Yeah, I guess we also had one school in Boston where prayer happened, and also there was an incident at the school, a shooting that had happened. Unfortunately, it was a staff member who shot one of the students, and after that incident, headmaster invited the church leaders to come and, in one sense, meet with the staff and sort of offer encouragement and words of encouragement during that difficult time. And then out of that, they also, before school, were meeting for prayer. So I would say, and then I would say in terms of teachers, Christian teachers and staff in the area, different folks have just kind of sought out each other and have formed their own sort of prayer groups, sometimes within the same school or across the city, or maybe in one church, gathering the educators together. And I would just say currently, I'm kind of part of a team of folks that are thinking about, how to support the staff who are looking for prayer for a community. And so I think I'll be talking to Marilyn soon just to learn more about what's happening in other parts of the country. But, I think churches, there are some church leaders who recognize that more support is needed. And so some churches have even convened breakfasts and other events to try and support their own educators in the area.
Eric, do you have anything that you want to add on this topic?
Yeah, just one comment, and that is adult-to-adult conversation. So if a teacher, and I'm taking your question to mean if a teacher reaches out to someone in a congregation and says, hey, I'd like to know more about your faith, that sort of conversation, adult-to-adult, consenting on talking about it, is perfectly fine. So, we're talking, when we talk about proselytizing, it has to do with adult to children, not adult to adult having a conversation. Those sorts of things, the government doesn't like to get involved with that. They don't want to dictate what kind of conversation two adults can have between one another. So if that comes up, if the opportunity arises and they reach out to you and say, hey, I'd like to know more about your church, or I've got this struggle going on in my own life, those sorts of conversations are perfectly acceptable.
Great. I wonder what, if you individually, each of you can share what resources you use, either print or web or video or audio. Do you find yourself sharing within the wider community when people are asking about this question, to help people either learn about and sort of understand the issue? So let's that first question. What resources do you have that you share that you would recommend around this separation of church and state question?
Who are you asking?
I'm going to raise your hand. Eric, you got some? First.
They can visit our website, gogateways.org.
Gogateways.org. Okay, Mary Liz will put that in the chat box.
And we have information for churches, for parents, for teachers, for all the spectrum of involvement. But there you can find, for instance, a document from the Department of Education on students' religious liberty. So there's questions about, is our public school faith-friendly enough for the students? Well, they can download some information directly from the Department of Education. And then what you do is you give it to a teacher or an administrator with hey, I thought you'd find this helpful. This might help you avoid some embarrassing problems, because you're now on the side of the school not wanting them to get into a problem because a teacher has unnecessarily shut down student speech. So those sorts of resources can be real helpful. Another thing that they might find that we've done is we put together a school checklist. And so as you're building a relationship with the school and you've proven that you care about the school, you're working with the school, but as it comes up, I'd encourage you to go through our school checklist. And what it does is it focuses on school district policy and schools' practices regarding academic freedom, regarding the Bible and Christianity, and religious freedom regarding student expression, that sort of thing. And so you can simply go through that checklist, and if something arises in the course of your relationship, you notice, for instance, hey, you know, I went to the Christmas program, and we've been involved with the school for a couple of years now, helping them with mentoring, but I noticed in the Christmas program, they didn't have any Christmas carols. Maybe our school district needs a better policy regarding how to address religious holidays. Maybe they don't even know that one exists. Well, they can click on our link, go to a school district that has a great policy, download that, and in the course of a relationship, not going and presenting before the school board, but in the course of a relationship, say, hey, this might be a policy you'd be interested in considering, because I think it'll be more inclusive and recognize the full nature of a holiday. And it doesn't have to be just secular. It can also recognize the religious elements of it. And that's more inclusive for the faith community that we're in. And so those sorts of opportunities can arise in the course of relationship. And if they check out our school checklist, they can kind of go through and just evaluate, how's our school doing with this? And maybe they need a little tune-up here and there. Great.
Thank you so much. Marilyn or Ruth, either of you have any suggestions to share?
I do. I do recommend Eric's website. I use it. And so Teachers Who Pray can be all things to all people. So I partner with organizations that specialize and do great work. And I don't try to duplicate what they do. And so I would also endorse Eric's gateways.org, right, Eric?
Yeah, gogateways.org.
And then also, though, there's the Christian Educators Association International. They offer teachers a membership, a free membership, but then they also have a paid membership per year, so that if you do encounter some kind of legal issue, that you can have legal representation just in case, and get some resources, some legal resources ongoing whenever you need it. And I think that's really helpful as well. And then finally, and that is, I think that's ceai.org. And then finally, I recommend Pastor Tony Evans has a church in Dallas, Texas, and they have the National Adopt a School Initiative. And I went to the training recently, and I thought it was fabulous. They have a wealth of information about how churches can actually adopt a school and how that looks. They have a memorandum of understanding. They want it very clear what the church will do, and it's good for a year. And I think the key is being consistent. Like, schools don't want fly-by-night help. They want help that they can depend on. And so that is also a big part of the Adopt a School initiative. And it's like they give you a thumb drive with tons of resources on it. I just highly recommend any church that's really looking to build a partnership with a local school to get the National Adopt a School Initiative training, because I've learned so much about how to position yourself as a faith-based partner with the local school.
Great. Ruth, do you have some stuff to add to that?
Yeah, just, well, I found an article that was produced by the U.S. Department of Education. It's a little old. It's from 1999. It's called How Faith Communities Support Children's Learning in Public Schools. And so this is from the government, and I think Mary Liz will share a link for that. You can Google it and find it. But at the end, towards the end of that document, it has a list of what to do, what not to do. So I think that kind of very succinctly captures a lot of what we said today. And then to give credit to Mary Liz, she introduced me to another article. I'll just tell you the title. It's called Public Schools and Religious Communities, a First Amendment Guide. And this is more recent, from 2016. So I think both documents could be really resourceful.
Great. Great. Thank you. Thank you all very much. I just want to mention a couple of things that we've learned from our community, which includes the three of you and everybody on the call and everybody else who's interested in all this work. One is that there's a lot of evidence that schools that have healthy relationships with their communities have improved school cultures. And there is a direct research correlated relationship between the quality of school culture and student learning outcomes. So this work around building relationally based, as Eric has been emphasizing, service-oriented, long-term, high-quality relationships between our congregations and our schools is there's a very solid research base for those of us to stand on when we say that this is good for kids, not only in the short term because they've got a tutor or a mentor or some kind of a relationship that's helping them, but actually there's an evidence base that over the long term at the school and the district level, it improves student outcomes. So that's an important thing for us to hold on to. I also want to connect back to the story that Marilyn was telling about that painful story about the school in Chicago that had 10% of its student body shot. The trauma that affected on the school and on every child and every adult in the building is hard for me to even imagine. We know a lot about the impact of trauma on the brain and how it shuts down learning. And I think one of the things that we can do as church partners is to continue to do our own learning around that topic and to understand that the antidote in the face of trauma, the antidote are long-term stable relationships that allow people to process what they've been through and to find some safe space. I'm not minimizing the impact of trauma, but there are things that congregations in our relationships with schools can do to address that. All right, so we're going to shift our conversation now a little bit more and see what kinds of questions our participants have come up with. But this is also a time for our panelists to ask one another questions. So let's turn first to Mary Liz and see what's been coming up in the chat function. But as she thinks about that and brings questions to our attention, Marilyn, Ruth, and Eric, give some thought to what you want to ask each other too. All right, to you, Mary Liz.
Sure, thanks, Lallie. One question that came up, Eric, you mentioned earlier on in the conversation that some of what happens when we experience resistance, and I think this can happen in our own congregations even, that people don't understand the law and there's some internal conflict about whether or not this is something that the church should pursue. But that one of the things that people have trouble with is the language that we use. And I'm wondering if you can give some examples of some of that problematic language, or things that you've heard that can be sort of triggers for folks to really just shut down a conversation, so that the people on our call have a sense of what some of that language sounds like.
Well, I like to remind audiences of two things. One, Jesus calls us to be salt and light, but I remind them that we use salt to make things better, not bitter. And our light should be a lamp and not a blowtorch. And sometimes we can make people bitter and we can burn everything in our path. But boy, we feel good because we stood for truth. So we need to be careful about that. And the other thing is, I like to say that oftentimes we Christians can be like bad tourists. We don't speak the language of the natives, and when they don't understand us, we just speak louder. And we need to think in terms of how do I communicate in a way that administrator or that teacher will understand. Don't bring the church into the school. Don't bring your churchy language. This is not about reaching kids for Christ and that sort of thing. That might be an internal motivation you have, but that's not how you talk. And it's not even, and you don't even want to have a hidden motive that you're trying to be sneaky about. I once had a teacher tell me how she led one of her kids to the Lord on their knees in the back of the classroom. Well, my Christian heart says, wonderful. My professional mind says, that's illegal. You can't do that. I had a phone call from a gentleman who a teacher who said, hey, one of my kids wants to become a Christian. He knows I'm a Christian. He wants to become a Christian. What do I do? I said, well, we respect parental rights, correct? Oh, yeah, sure. We respect that. Okay. So call the parents. Well, it's a single mom. Okay, we'll call the mom and explain what the son has said to you and ask if you can have coffee with her and the son at a Denny's somewhere off location, and that you can share what it means to be a Christian, and then he can decide what he wants to do in that setting. And the mom was like, hey, look, whatever makes my boy a better boy, I'm fine with that. And so they had coffee. He shared the gospel. The child decided, yes, I want to be a Christian. Did it right there in front of the mom. That's honoring. And so often I think we those within the Christian community kind of look at the schools as, I'm trying to smuggle Bibles behind a closed country. I'm trying to do something sneaky. And as soon as you do that sort of thing, that's where you lose faith and confidence of the administrators you're trying to reach and help. And so you just need to be authentic, be careful in the language that you use, think in terms of what's important to them, and don't bring church into that environment, but instead speak the language of the natives.
Great, thank you. And Ruth, I think this question I'm going to send to you first, but if you could share some examples of churches who have gotten this really right. So churches who, maybe set some groundwork before they even went into school, or if you know of churches that were having conversations internally about this to take with them as they went into school, that would be great.
What's that for?
I'm sorry, what? Oh,
I'm sorry. Was that for you, Ruth?
Oh, both of us can take it. Do you want to go first? You can go first. I'm still thinking a little bit, so.
Okay. Well, I had mentioned Tony Evanson's church, Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship in Dallas, Texas. They actually have adopted about 32 or 33 schools. I mean, it's a mega church. And they are constantly in school, so much so that they're over a couple different school districts. And the school district has given some of the church members a school district email on their website because they're so active. And so that is one really great example. They've been doing it for about 30 years now, working in community. And there are some churches here in Chicago, like the one I mentioned at the school. It's not a large congregation either. It's a very small congregation, but they're serving the Harper High School. One thing I would like to add, though, is I'm kind of piggybacking off of what Eric just said. There is absolutely a way. So if you want to reach children for Christ as a church, and that is your motivation, there are some after-school club programs that exist that do that. There's like Good News Clubs through Child Evangelism Fellowship. There's a group called Crossroads Kids Club. So basically, they're after-school clubs. They don't cost the school anything. They're free to the school. It requires parental permission, but it's very open. It says what it plans to do and what it wants to do with the kids. There's no smuggling in the Bible. It is a Bible program sponsored by a local church. And it's after school, which is legal as long as the school district allows like agents to come in after school, other than secular agents. So if you get enough kids to sign up and the principal is on board with it, then you can have it. But there's a time and a place for that. It's not during the school day where the kids are supposed to be understanding academic instruction. So I just wanted to make that statement, because for some people, that's what they want. And that some churches, they want to be very explicitly Christ-centered and offer that to children, but they have to follow the proper protocols and do it above board.
And one more thing on that, Marilyn. There's also religious release time. About 40 states have laws that allow students to go off campus during school hours and receive religious instruction for an hour and come back on and not be counted absent. It's called religious release time. And local churches can be involved in that as well. So yes,
Great.
you're absolutely right. There are a couple of different ways that a church could approach that if they wanted to.
Great, thank you. Ruth, did you come up with an example to share?
Well, I guess I don't know if it's an example as in just saying that there are many examples for me where a church, whether with the leaders of the school or, as people mentioned before, with parents of the students that they're working with, that they've built a relationship. And I think relationship for me is really the key word, because in relationship, you're mutually sharing with each other about who you are. And so I think for me, the churches have done it well, really have spent that time to be present, to be faithful, and then to build relationship. And as Eric mentioned, with parents, when the parents know who you are and what you do, and they, trust you with their child, and know, as you have things you want to, if they, like, kind of Eric's example is perfect. So basically saying that, the parents really know exactly what you're about, that's always the best scenario. And so we have churches that I think have done really good training with the mentors. And so I think training is big, with the volunteers and the tutors and mentors to say, these are some examples, and what can you do, what can't you do, and then to encourage them to build relationship with the adults that are in the child's life.
My local congregation here on Cape Cod has a partnership with a local elementary school that's now only in its second year. And the way that we handled this that seems to have worked really well was that we had a preliminary meeting with the principal and some of her senior staff, and we explained that as neighbors in the community who care for the children, we were interested in exploring establishing a long-term relationship with the school. And we were very clear about the fact that our motivation for doing this is because we believe as Christians this is our calling, it's our privilege and our responsibility. But I also was very direct with her right at the same time to acknowledge that we understand that religious speech and activity belongs in church and not at the school. And we started our first goal. One of the things that we recommend within all our children is that we recommend that emerging partnerships under promise and over deliver, because the relationship of trust is so important. And our goal that we established in conversation with the school was that every teacher who wanted one would have a volunteer in her classroom for at least 1 hour a week on a regular and consistent basis. And we have reached that goal. And now more teachers are asking for more volunteers. So now we're growing. But by starting very small, by claiming and being very direct about our motivation, by taking responsibility for our volunteers, and every volunteer there are a number of steps that our volunteers have to go through, so that before we will give them permission to be in the school. We feel that we've been able to establish a good relationship with the school, and they recently have said to us that I think we maybe have a dozen people in the building on a weekly basis, and they've already said to us that we are one of the more reliable partnerships that they have in the community. And I feel what we've accomplished is so modest. It's a first beginning, but we're pleased, and we look forward to it growing. Yeah. Mary Liz, do you have another question for us?
No, if you all have questions for each other or other follow-ups, go for it.
All right. So, yeah, Eric.
I was just thinking in what you were sharing there, that for those who do have, they want to we need to see ourselves as one piece in God's plan for that community, those children, and so forth. I think often we Americans, we're so used to sales and closing the deal. And I've got to get these kids to church, or I've got to get and we can see, like what you're doing there with your local school. You're one piece of what God is doing in the lives of people. And if we can see ourselves as contributing to that one piece, that can be good enough. That doesn't have to be, oh, well, I didn't get them to come to church. I didn't get them to accept Christ. That's okay. You're one step, you're one piece of helping the community understand the value of the Christian faith and its impact on people's lives, as demonstrated by the people who are volunteering in the school.
Well, I have aspirations, and my hope is that we might grow into something like what Ruth works with up in the Boston area, which is a huge coalition of congregations, each of which has a partnership with a local school. Ruth, how many congregations are part of the Education Collaborative at this point?
Well, we're always adjusting our numbers, so I need to update
they're changing all the time.
And some partnerships do take a pause or end. It's not a bad thing sometimes for them to take a break. I would say that we're at this point for congregations, we're up to close to 40.
Yeah, and that
and Somerville, Austin, Cambridge, Somerville, Framingham.
Yeah. And they come together a couple of times a year. And so there's a sense of being in, even though, Eric, as you were saying, what we may be doing in my partnership with St. Mary's is small. I would love to have the feeling that we were part of a community of congregations in my part of the state, all of whom have a shared sense of value of wanting to support quality public education for all children. And I also want to begin to have conversations about root causes, so that we can begin to understand the inequities and their origins, and therefore what we might be able to do about them. So the relationships are both between us and the school. They are within us in the congregation, but they're also, I think, between our congregation and the others in the community. Some of them on the school board, some of the Boys and Girls Club, those kinds of organizations. Yeah. So that's a little bit off topic. Let me just, before we go on, Eric, let me just touch base with Marilyn and see whether you have any thoughts. I can easily go wandering down a rabbit hole, but I don't want to do that. That's for another webinar.
Just any free thoughts, or?
On this topic about respecting this public space. I mean, this is really what,
Yeah. So once, so many ways I can go with this, but oftentimes the challenge that I see is to get church folk to understand that Christ engaged with the world, with people outside of the church building. That is being his hands and his feet. That's being Christ-like. That's being a follower of Christ, is doing what Christ did. And one way to reach an entire community is through interacting with a school, because you have adults and professionals and families. You have those who have and those who have not, all in one place in a safe environment. And so it's just the gold mine for opportunity to serve and to touch people's lives. And it will challenge if you let it will challenge some of the assumptions that you've made about what the problem in the world is. Because oftentimes I found this out just because I was a reporter before I became a teacher. And so being in the school really has challenged my idea of what the problem is. Who are the perpetrators? Who are the victims? How did we get here? Why is it like this? And so I think just from a congregational standpoint, if you want to deepen your relationship with Christ and your understanding of the scripture, go work in a school. Go see the need. Go try to help. It's sometimes people want to go and help the other person, the like less than poor inner city or rural poor Black kid, or, you know, whatever their notion of like the poor is. But then doing this kind of work, I think if you let it, will take your understanding of poverty and realize that we all have a poverty somewhere. If you let it, you will understand how to see the richness in someone else's poverty and see the poverty in your richness and your wealth. And so I just want to encourage people to do this, looking not just to help someone else, but to also kind of understand your place in the world a little better and how you can be a better person, a better Christ follower as you are serving those who have less than you.
And I think we're going to let Marilyn have the last word on that one. That was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Marilyn. We're going to we're going to begin to close our time together now on the call. We value the feedback of everybody who's here as a participant. Mary Liz is about to, if she hasn't already, posted a link in the chat box that we would like you please to follow and to fill out a brief evaluation. We read these very carefully. We always learn from them. And we are committed to continuous growth and improvement within our community. We'd also welcome you to actually type in the chat box itself answers to 2 questions. What worked well for you on our webinar today? What did you value? What surprised you? What was a great benefit or a source of joy? We would also like to know what your suggestions might be for what we might do differently next time. Those are 2 equally valuable questions for us. Our time will be in about 3 minutes. We'll be signing off. And what's going to happen then is that Mary Liz and I and our 3 panelists are going to stay on the call for a debrief. But at 3:15, our webinar will end. And we're so glad that you were able to be with us here today. As I mentioned earlier, that the recording of the webinar is available on our Facebook page and will be posted to our website, and you'll receive a link to it when that's available. In addition to these panel discussions that we have on the 4th Tuesday of every month, we're expanding our programming this year to add a direct presentation on the first Tuesday of the month. So next week, I will be talking about our pathway to partnership. And this is what we've learned from our network about the stages of forming a congregational community partnership between a congregation and a school, what to aim for, what happens, what the steps are, but they're not really steps. It turns out it's kind of a meandering path, and sometimes you get started and then you go back and you start again. So we're going to be exploring that, and we would love to have everybody join us, because that pathway can only be as valid as it resonates and makes sense with you in your own experiences. So I'll be presenting it, but it'll be more sharing it and talking about it, and we'll have opportunities for people to participate in that. Our next paneled conversation on April 24th will be about how congregations can benefit from working with community organizing organizations. These are broad-based community organizations that in many regions of the country are focused on education justice, education equity, that equip and train and lift up local leaders to be leading and responding to the initiatives in their own context. And we look forward to learning more, and hope you all be with us at that time. Finally, next month, we're launching our online learning cohort. And this is for partnership leaders who are seeking a community of practice. We will be asking people to make a commitment to participate in 8 conference calls over the course of the rest of this calendar year. It will be a closed group, so once it gets started, it won't have people dropping in and dropping out. We will be doing some shared accountability to goals that we set ourselves, and we'll be doing some direct instruction in order to deepen the leadership skills of the folks on that call. If you're interested in that, you can apply through our website, allourchildren.org/cohort, or you can leave a message in the chat box and we'll follow up with you afterwards. Thank you so much to Marilyn and Ruth and Eric for being with us here today, and for each of you for participating and joining us. And we hope you will be back again sometime soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.